Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me for my regular update from Washington. Let me start with the topic that seems to be circling back on a regular basis. If you feel like this is a rerun of previous conversations we had about the continuing resolution and making sure we don't go through the stupidity of shutting down the government tomorrow night. The good news is that the Senate will pass its continuing resolution within the next hour or so. My understanding is that the House, because of the concerns about further weather challenges, will act potentially later tonight, and we will have once again prevented the awfulness of a shutdown, but simply extended the government funding till early March. The good news on that will be that the top lines have been agreed to, the dollar totals. Now the work of each of the individual subcommittees in terms of their allocations will have to be worked through. The document will have to be written up, but I'm confident that we will not see a shutdown, at least caused by the Senate. And I think the Speaker's indicated he will move on the bill later this afternoon. That's good news. My hope is as well, and I was at a meeting yesterday with the President and senior bipartisan leadership of the security committees from the House and the Senate. My hope is that once we're ensuring the government staying open through March, that we can move immediately to the issue around the so-called supplemental. That means assistance for Ukraine. It means assistance for Israel. It means humanitarian assistance to a series of nations in that region who are experiencing a great deal of turmoil. And it means that there will be serious changes in terms of our border policy. These are linked together. I think there has been strong negotiations taking place. I think they are literally days or hours away from concluding, and my hope is that we can move to that legislation next week. The clock is ticking on Ukraine. Without further assistance, Ukraine is just not going to be successful. Vladimir Putin will be successful in his unjustified war against Ukraine, and much of the sacrifice made by the Ukrainians will go for naught. So we've got to get that assistance to the Ukrainians. We also have to make sure that we shore up some of the humanitarian issues in the Middle East, as well as continuing to stand by Israel's ability to degrade and eliminate some of the terrorist threat that's posed by Hamas. So I'm sure we can come back to questions on that. Two other items I want to raise at the top. One is, as you all know, I'm chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and I am gravely concerned that as we go into the 2024 election, we will see foreign malign influence in terms of misinformation and disinformation coming from Russia, coming from China, coming from Iran, and other nation states that we're adversaries with. And my concern is, and I wrote the head of CISA, the cybersecurity agency that is supposed to be working with the social media companies and others, I don't think we're nearly as prepared in 2024. Frankly, I don't even think we're as prepared in 2024 as we were in 2020, because there is an overhang of a court case that came up in Texas that is trying to restrict the government's ability to even have voluntary communications with the social media companies. If we can't have that kind of linkage in stopping foreign malign influence, our hands are going to be tied. And there are some of these social media platforms, Twitter or X in particular, who simply are just not very collaborative, not just here in the United States, but in terms of election protection efforts around the world. So I've contacted CISA. I'm trying to help. Our Intelligence Committee is going to be out holding hearings on this issue. We need to be better prepared. We've got enough divisions in our own country back and forth without those being amplified or further stirring the pot by particularly Russia, which has shown from 2016 to 2020, an ability to interfere in our elections and candidly in other elections around the world, and we've got to be prepared. And then finally, we all know the scourge of fentanyl is the most deadly activity, kills more Americans now than any other item, frankly, even more than car crashes, more than obviously any of the other drug infestations that we have in our nation. So joining with a number of other Democratic senators, we put forward a bill to combat fentanyl at the border. That would mean better screening of some of the cargo containers that are coming in. That would mean better screening in terms of some of the guns that are going from the United States into Mexico to help support the cartels. This is common sense. The truth is, a lot of the fentanyl that's coming into our country is not coming in on the undocumented people who are coming into our country. It's coming in through our normal ports of entry. And we've got the technology and we've got the tools. They simply need to be funded to make sure that we're doing a better job of screening against this horrific drug at our border. And I hope we will be able to see action on that legislation shortly. So other items, but I know it's a little bit late getting started, so why don't I go to Laura and we can start your questions.
Senator, our first question will be Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for joining us. Related to the supplemental, do you feel that once we get past the shutdown, there was, Senate Majority Leader Schumer yesterday had a lot of optimism coming out of that meeting. Do you share that optimism, and do you think that this whole thing is finally potentially coming together pretty soon?
There was not a member, Democrat or Republican, House or Senate, in the meeting with the president yesterday that didn't acknowledge that it would be a disaster if we walked away from Ukraine. Not only in terms of giving Putin a green light to finish the job in Ukraine, but we could potentially be seeing American soldiers in harm's way because many of us believe that Putin will not stop with Ukraine. They may go after the Baltic states or Poland. You're then talking about NATO nations and the potential to actually have American troops in harm's way. I also made the point that this supplemental includes not only assistance for Ukraine, but Israel, for some of our concerns vis-a-vis China in the Indo-Pacific region. But if we walk away from Ukraine, what country would ever trust us again? There are so many nation states that are looking, shall we go with the alliance of democracies or shall we go with the authoritarian nations? If America doesn't keep its word, my fear is that the negative ramifications will be, frankly, historic, not just in terms of what happens to the Ukrainian people, but to our standing in the world. So people all acknowledge that. The point I made is I think let's see the changes that have been agreed to on the border. I think they are going to be dramatic. You've heard Republican senior leaders say, you couldn't even get this kind of strong border protection and cut the flow of people coming into our country, even if the Republicans controlled all three branches, the Senate, the House, and the presidency, or all three levers of power, because it would be hard for them to get the 60 votes. This is a moment in time. Those who believe, and I believe, we have a crisis at the border. My hope is that our friends in the House, the Republicans in the House, will take yes for an answer and allow us to move on to that legislation next week.
Senator,
thank you very much.
Senator, our next question is Madison McNamee with NBC 12.
Hi, Senator. So I know that you all were trying to get a postal town hall to happen by tomorrow. You all wrote that letter to the USPS, and obviously now that's not happening. So I was just kind of wondering, what are your all's next steps moving forward? I mean, how are you going to be holding them accountable now?
We have challenges with mail delivery, not just in the Richmond area, but across the Commonwealth, and for that matter, across the country. The post office is having a really hard time recruiting and retaining personnel. I've been on this issue, first came to light even before some of the areas with Congresswoman McClellan and Senator Kaine and I in Charlottesville, where this has been an issue for literally for years. I'm very disappointed The Postal Service did not hold that town hall. I think what I intend to do is go higher in the postal office hierarchy, because I think there's an obligation to hear out from consumers of the Postal Service, from people who need to have their mail delivered, need to, get the bills or get their medicines delivered. I think this idea that the postal office, at least the Central Virginia level, turned down the public hearing, that's just not acceptable. That's not an answer. And working with Senator Kaine and Congresswoman McClellan, and frankly, others in the delegation, we're going to find a way to make that happen.
Senator, our next question is Michael Martz with the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Hello, Senator. I'm interested in how you gauge the Speaker's ability to deliver on the stopgap spending bill, excuse me, at the 1.66 trillion level, that was top line number that was negotiated. He sort of seemed to backtrack a little last week, or earlier this week, I guess it was last week, about whether or not he was firm on that. Do you think he can deliver? And then also then the appropriations bills that would then allocate that money?
There are a small group of members, and I don't say this reflects the whole Republican Party by any means, but there is a small group, extreme members of the House, that want to hold the government hostage. They're not going to vote for anything. And the fact is the Republican majority now is, I believe, down to 2 votes, the thinnest majority of any time in our country's history in the House of Representatives. So the only way the Speaker's going to get anything done, and it's just plain math, is he's got to use the Democrats. And because he inherited a Rules Committee that was set up by the previous Speaker, where they ceded power to some of these extremists, there's no way he can even get a rule for, and that means how you even bring a bill to the floor under traditional circumstances, because the no crowd will, they don't mind shutting down the government. They don't mind the pain it causes to Americans for their ideological purposes. It's abhorrent in my mind. But the way that I think he will have to get the continuing resolutions passed and then the appropriations is what's called on the consent calendar, that requires not 218 votes, but 290 votes. So there is no other path other than strong bipartisan majorities to get anything done now in the House of Representatives. And that was created, I think, in many ways by the previous Speaker trying to give in to the demands of this group of individuals who are so extreme they can't even agree on what their demands are, other than they want to blow up the functioning of our government in many ways. And frankly, they're more vindictive towards other Republicans than they are even to Democrats. So, Michael, I think they got to, he's going to have to do it on the consent calendar to get 290 votes.
Senator, our next question is Mike Gooding with 13 News Now.
Hi there, Senator. I wanted to get your take on what's going on these days in the Red Sea with the Houthi rebels. The Pentagon said yesterday that our retaliatory strikes have been simply to degrade the Houthis' ability to launch further strikes. And so I'm wondering if you think we can be successful at this, or are you concerned that we're going to get drawn into a expanding regional conflict?
Well, I am concerned about the expansion of the conflict. I also know the United States has been strongly urging, Saudi Arabia, and I was in the region in Saudi Arabia and Israel and Jordan about a week ago, to actually make peace with the Houthis, because there's been huge humanitarian issues with the Yemeni people, and so I think the one thing that I heard in the region was that the Houthis are pretty crummy at governing, but they're pretty good at fighting. And they were able to hold off Saudi and UAE, much more powerful nations, literally for a couple years. So the other thing we heard is that the Houthis' leadership thinks that they are higher in standing than the Iranians. leadership. And in many ways, while the Iranians have helped supply some of the materials to the Houthis are a fairly independent entity. And I think it's appropriate that we try to take out some of their military capability. They are very adept at moving their rocket launchers and other equipment very quickly. They had to get adept at that to be able to hold off, the kind of carpet bombing the Saudis brought against them. So I do think we are striking back in a way that tries to thread the needle of degrading their ability without, frankly, escalating to where you take out a lot of the Houthi leadership that might lead to this broader regional conflict. I also think it's important, and I commend the administration on this, is this traffic that goes through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal is essential for global commerce, that it is not just America, it's America, Britain, Canada, Australia, the Dutch, Bahrain, other nations who are part of this coalition to strike against the Houthi capabilities. My hope is, well, that other nations like India and China, who rely on a lot of this traffic through the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal, can weigh in as well and try to ratchet back the Houthis, again, who are not doing anything, frankly, to help the Palestinians. They're not to help deliver a single truck of aid to the folks in Gaza. They are simply trying to elevate their position as part of this global terrorist network, and that is a real concern and a real threat. And I think our strikes back have struck the right balance, at least to date.
Senator, our final question is Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. What is the best way for the average Virginian to discern and combat potential misinformation and disinformation in the 2024 election?
Amy, that is a great question. One of the things that I think we need, and some of the artificial intelligence companies have said they will do what's called watermarking, authentication, so that if you see a video, you'll know if it's been doctored by AI. We've got to force those companies to actually do what they say they're going to do, so that consumers can see if their documents or videos have been altered, that may be appearing in terms of representation of candidates or their positions. I think we need the administration, frankly, to lean in more, regardless of this Texas case, and communicate more with the social media companies so that we can work hand in hand. I'm not talking about limiting anybody's First Amendment rights. We as Americans can debate any issue we want. I'm focused on foreign malign influence. And if we can't talk to the social media companies, who are oftentimes the distributors of this misinformation and disinformation, even the ones who want to do the right thing, then our ability to educate Americans about these tools that may manipulate either in images or in text is going to be greatly undermined. So we've got to do a better job of educating. And frankly, this was something that, as difficult and as much of an election denier that Donald Trump is, his administration actually, combined with the intelligence community, did a pretty good job in 2020 of trying to keep out some of the foreign malign actors. We've got to at least do as well as we did in 2020 in 2024, or we could have the bad guys play a hugely disproportionate role in affecting how people vote.
Senator, that was our final question.
Be well.